rightly so, start for a few people who arrive a minute or two late. In the old days, we called that Jewish time. I never really liked that expression. But okay. Well, the subject today is how different was the world of the Bible from our world? And everything that's been happening lately, especially in the last week, has kind of put a little twist of perspective on all of that. Like, I mean, just how different is our world now from our world 3 months ago? Is pretty extraordinary. So to talk about comparing our world to what the world on another continent 3,000 years ago, that raises a question of whether we can really get at that. And we only have two ways to get at that, and that's the text of the Bible and archaeology. There isn't a third unless somebody invents a time machine, which is interesting. But here we are meeting in this horrible week. It struck me that the safest humans at the moment are the ones in space. So just on this worst day so far in recent months was the same day that SpaceX went up, which would have been this kind of joyous day, and we'd all go, oh, isn't that wonderful? And then you go, I'm thinking what those two guys in there, as they docked with the space station, must have been saying, thank God, we got off of the Earth. Those people up there are the safest people in the world, except they're not in the world. I mean, that's the point. And that we've come that far is amazing. And then to talk about how different our world is from what it was 3,000 years ago may make today's discussion seem silly. But no, it's okay. We can do it. Because here's something that connects us to that world. Just in the last couple of weeks also, there was a discovery some of you may have heard about at Arad. It's a city in the southern part of Israel in the Negev. And Arad, during biblical times, in the Iron Age, had a temple. And the temple there was excavated by Professor Aharoni, archaeologist at the University of Tel Aviv in the 70s. And it was exciting partly to me because in my first work, the first key I thought in my search for who wrote the Bible was discovering that the ancient tabernacle was located inside the first temple. And part of that was the measurements of it, which was 20 cubits long by 6 or 8 cubits wide. And then they discovered this temple at Arad, and it was 20 cubits long by 6 cubits wide. I mean, that's like when Woody Allen pulled Marshall McLuhan out from behind the column in Annie Hall. I mean, it was too good to be true that somebody just digs up exactly what you needed. And the last few weeks, though, they made another discovery at the Temple of Arad. And that is there are these two columns in front of it. They show about this high from the ground. And there was burnt material on both of them at the top. So they studied that, some folks studied that burnt material, and on one of them, the one that would be on my left when I'm facing, so it's on the right side of the temple when you're facing it, they found incense at the top of it. And on the other one, they found marijuana. Now, what are we going to do with that? So not everything has changed, in 3,000 years. And it's very funny because once somebody said to me half jokingly, I mean, decades ago, I don't remember who it was who said it to me. So if it was any one of you, would you please get back to me on this? Somebody said to me who thought that the laws about the burning of incense in the Torah probably were about some sort of drug. And he went by some of the rules that there are about incense, like, for example, that only the priests can use it. You're not, the incense, the Torah in the Bible, you're not allowed to have it in your home. It's only for use by the priests at the temple. That's interesting. So now I find out that at the entrance to one of the temples, they've got marijuana. I go, maybe that guy, whoever that was decades ago, was right. I don't know. But, I mean, that substance has been known in the Middle East for a very long time, So now I know all of you are soon going to be going off on your trips to Israel one of these days, once they ever open everything up again. And I can guess what your first stop is going to be. I think it's decriminalized there. I think it's illegal but decriminal. Well, let me get back though to the subject. You remember the subject. It was how different was the world of the Bible from our world. There are two stages to Judaism. When I teach an Intro to Judaism course, the first thing I teach, the first day, in the first minutes, is Judaism's had just two stages, the biblical stage and the rabbinic stage. Now that's not exactly right because everything then changes. So, okay, well, we'll soften it in a minute. But the biblical stage is presumably from the late 13th or 12th century BCE until the end of the Bible, which, if you mean the end of the Bible's story, that would be what happens in Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther, maybe Daniel. If you mean the end of when the Bible was written, we think the latest thing written in the Bible was the book of Daniel, which was not at the time of Daniel. It's written like possibly during the Maccabean period. So that's still the 2nd century or so BCE. So the biblical period is somewhere, the biblical stage of Judaism is something like 1,000 years, very close to 1,000. And the rabbinic stage, I don't know when it starts. I know that it continues until this second. So we're still in the rabbinic stage of Judaism. And, but it doesn't begin the minute the biblical stage ends, right? So when the Bible is done being written and no more books there are other books being written, but they didn't make it into the Bible. So during those few hundred years between that and when the rabbis really get going and take over and they write the Mishnah and that becomes the dominant legal work, there's a period there where the scholars of that period speak of Judaisms, plural. Now you understand, I'm not in my field now. I've said I don't do AD. I don't even do these last couple centuries BCE. I just mix BCE and AD. That shows how liberal and ecumenical I am. And they, there were different forms of there were the Essenes and there's the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and they're all different models of where people thought Judaism should go next. And the rabbis won, so that by around 200 CE anyway, Judaism is becoming a rabbinic religion. And those who will continue to protest and say, you rabbis are not right, that's not our religion. Our religion is supposed to be like in the Bible, which are the Karaites. And but the Karaites, for a while, were even competition for the Rabbinites, the people who were pro-rabbis. And but in the end, the Karaites lost, and today there are Karaites, and officially they're considered not Jews, which is absurd because Karaites are the most authentic Jews of all. They're the ones most like the original biblical Judaism. I mean, if I met a nice Karaite woman, I'd marry her, and I wouldn't regard it as an intermarriage, But I'm already married to Janet, and she's rabbinically Jewish, so problem settled. And I guess I should tell all of you out there, every week I have my wife Janet in the room, so that's the entire audience. But that's good to have even one person, so I get a laugh, if I tell a joke or something. But Janet is away this week. So if you don't hear that on the side, could you please just smile every now and then or something so I know that there's a reaction. I don't feel as funny this week as normally anyway, but just for that reason, we may need it more this week. So I'm sorry Janet's not here. She may be listening where she is, but she's with her children today. So these two stages of Judaism, you remember that was the subject, was 1,000 years for the biblical stage and almost 2,000 for the rabbinic stage, which is a pretty darn good run. And a couple of centuries of mixed Judaisms in between. I remember when I first came to be a professor in the first job in San Diego, and I was giving an Intro to Judaism course, and I was explaining to the class about the difference that there were the Rabbinites and the Karaites. And my friend Jonathan Seville, who hadn't heard about that before, without missing a beat, he looked up and said, well, of course Rabbinites eat Karaites. So, you know, if Jews are very fast, you know. So first of all, we've been in a different stage of Judaism with a whole different set of rules for a couple of thousand years. And we'll come to the part about how all the differences were, but I mean to have a completely separate talk on that, and it'll be, I'll plug it now. Someday, keep watching, one of our meetings will be titled Before There Were Rabbis, and it'll be about the biblical world and what the change was. But today, we're just accepting that there was such a change and that our world is very different from the biblical world. And I was going to rattle off to you like 20 things that were different about the biblical world from our world. Oh, well, they had one temple. We have synagogues. They had sacrifices. We don't have sacrifices. They did, and so they had incense and marijuana. We don't have incense. So a lot of things have changed, and I was going to deal with a lot of them. But as I was preparing, I found that each one, you know, gets pretty intriguing and is worth a lot of time. So I'm just going to do one this first time. And that's great, because that'll leave me like another 20. If I run out of things to talk about as subjects, you know, I'm ready to go. So what should we make this first thing about? What was so different about the biblical world from ours? And I'll come to one general one, and then I'll get to the specific thing that's the subject of today. The general things, it seems to me the biggest difference between the biblical world and ours is the world of the Bible was a world without the Bible, right? The Bible, it wasn't all written yet. It wasn't edited. It wasn't put together. It wasn't canonized. Nobody owned one. Nobody could turn to it for authority. There wasn't a word for it. Somebody say, read the, and couldn't finish the sentence. There was just the Torah, but the Torah comes in way down near the very end of the biblical period, right? The first time I think the full Torah existed, it's in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that the Levites stood up publicly at the time of Ezra at a place called, get ready, the Watergate. That's really what it says. And they read for the first time publicly the Torah. And it describes some of the things that people heard that day. And it certainly looks to me like the Torah that they were reading that day, if the book of Ezra is correct, is almost the same Torah that we have now. It wasn't, you know, one like, you know, it's a thou shalt steal. I mean, it wasn't different. It was basically the same, I think, even word for word. And there were different copies and manuscripts. So we know that we do text critical stuff to get at the original, but it was essentially our Torah. But that's only the Torah. That's the first 5 books. And that's only at the end of the biblical period. So the biblical world was a world without the Bible. No one official standard that everybody had to follow and that everybody agreed was their scripture. Now, let me take one of the differences between that world and ours. And the one I decided to pick was the relations of men and women, the status of men and women. Now, this is not a general woman in the Bible talk. I've given that talk. We've all given that talk about woman in the Bible. And we all, you know, oh, Sarah and Rachel, and we know. And there's a lot to be said about it, and it's too much for single talk anyway. But this isn't about the whole thing about women in the Bible. And I mean, I'm qualified, as many of you noticed. I'm a man. But my mother was one. So I learned a lot about women. And the this isn't about that. It's all specifically only about how the sex is related, okay? And how different that was. First of all, they went by patrilineal descent. If your father was a Jew, you were a Jew. If your father was a Levite, you were a Levite. If your father was a Kohen, you were a Kohen. If your father was from Issachar, you were from Issachar. It went father to son, strictly male, strictly patrilineal. Now, you all know that that changed so much in the post-biblical world that today the majority of Jews judge the official status of whether you're a Jew or not by your mother. And the Orthodox and most of the conservatives among Jews still go by that. Reform has changed and goes by either parent. But biblically, it was neither the either nor the male, the female. It went only by the father. Isaac is in because his father Abraham was. He didn't get in on Sarah, he got in on Abraham. And that continues through the whole biblical, okay, this is good. This continues through the whole biblical period with, as far as I can tell, not a single exception. Not a single exception. It always goes by the father in biblical times. Somewhere in post-biblical times, the Jews changed and made it going by the mother instead, which in those first generations must have been really complicated. And you ask why? Jews. So we changed it. Maybe it was because you can know more with more certainty who your mother is than your father. Maybe because of rape. I've heard, all the theories, but it changed and no one knows exactly when. So much so that, a friend of mine who's an Orthodox rabbi, when he reads back into the Torah, he absolutely thinks it's matrilineal then too. And so they're taking the way we do it in our rabbinic Jewish world and reading it back into the Bible, but that's simply not correct. It's never correct. It's always patrilineal in the Bible. Now that is a different world and a different way of judging who you are than ours. Second biggest point about the relations of the sexes, polygamy. Their world was polygamous and ours isn't. And I remember a great biblical scholar, I'm laughing. She used to say, you shouldn't make fun of polygamies, they can't help it if they're short. Now, that's not funny in a certain sense because pygmies actually are a different race. So that actually is a racist remark, but I don't think Goldie meant it that way, so I think it's fine. But now that we know that, we shouldn't do that anymore. But polygamy was the way. A man could have many wives, a woman couldn't have many husbands. And it wasn't that all the men had many wives. First of all, that arithmetically doesn't work. And secondly, it didn't work like that. It was the wealthier men, more powerful men could have many wives, and kings could have many wives. And that's how it is in today's cultures too, that have polygamy. A man has to be able to afford to have many wives. But that was the way of nature. Those of us who came here from San Diego, we used to go to the wild, in my 30 years that I lived in San Diego, you go to the wild animal park, this extraordinary place in San Diego where it's not like a zoo. The animals can run free. They're all out, they have acres and acres and acres of territory. And all they do is they make sure the territory where the lions are doesn't overlap with where the antelopes are, because then you'd have a smaller animal population. And the thing about it was often when we would go around the place with a zoo, a wild animal park guide, and they'd show us all these antelopes over there. And there'd be this one big male antelope at the top of a hill, and he's got all the females around him. And then there's another hill that had all the other males. And the staff there referred to that as Bachelor Hill, because that was all the antelopes who lost, because only the strongest antelope gets all the females. And, lions work that way too. The strongest lion gets all the females. Uncle Scar or Mufasa, whichever one is the strongest, gets all the females. And the point of that, from an evolutionary point of view, you can see how that would work. That way, the strongest male genes find their way into the most possible females. So in nature, I understand that. And also, those guys, they want a lot of girls. It's a male thing. Of course, we humans are completely different. And so these creatures would be like that in the early stages of human development too. And really, I say early stages in the biblical period. After all, it's not an early stage of human development. You're already, in civilization here, cities and business and travel and so on. And so the wealthier men and the kings and the powerful men could have many women. Now, what does that do? What is the difference between a world that works that way and our world? You could say, oh, wow, lucky guy, gets a lot of sex. But there's much more profound distinction there socially. The male has power in a world like that. Where a man has multiple wives, he has more power over them than a man who has only one wife. Take the story of King David. Whether it's historical or not, I don't know, could be. The story is that King David, when he was bringing the ark up to Jerusalem, he was dancing around, kind of gyrating in front of the whole crowd. All the masses of Israel have come out for the event. And he's wearing this ephod, this loose-fitting garment. And he doesn't have underwear. And that's mentioned elsewhere in the Bible. The only person who has to wear underwear is, the priest, because he shouldn't expose himself when he goes up the steps to the altar. But there's David. So David is exposing himself. And his wife, Michal, is looking out the window, and she sees him coming in and doing all this. So when he comes into the house, Michal says to her husband, David, well, how has the king of Israel shown himself today? How have you brought honor upon yourself, exposing yourself to every young girl in Israel? And David doesn't like being insulted by his wife, Michal. And he says, oh, you think I'm disgusting? I'll show you how disgusting I can be. And the next sentence in the text is, and Michal was childless to the day of her death, meaning he never slept with her again. So the man had power to deny his wife sex for the rest of her life because he had others, but she couldn't. Now that's a different world from ours. Also in a world like that, there's female competition among the females who are married to the same man. The Leah and Rachel story may be historical or it may be just a story, but either way, it reflects what would go on in such a world where Leah and Rachel compete for nights with their husband and producing the most sons. They compete for sex, they compete for children. And even Sarah and Hagar, where Sarah is a wife and Hagar is a concubine, which is presumably a lower status, when Hagar is the one who's able to have a child, when Sarah couldn't, it says that Sarah was lowered in Hagar's eyes because I get Abraham a son. It's more than you can do. And this is just a different world. My point is not just oh, isn't that interesting? They had polygamy. It's the whole social fabric is different. The relations of women to each other and the relations of the men to the women. And that brings me to one other topic in the middle of all that, which is female homosexuality. The Torah forbids male homosexuality. Now, I've written about that, and I believe it is possible to live a Torah true life and still for two men to be together. That's not the way most, especially Orthodox rabbis have ruled, but I think so. But that's not the subject for today. The question is about the women. And it's this curious fact about, you can check it, it's Leviticus 18, that the law says a man can't lie with a man the way he lies with women. And but it never says that women can't be with other women. The fact is the Torah explicitly forbids male homosexuality, but it doesn't forbid female homosexuality. So you go, well, why? So that's why we have Bible scholars. And some Bible scholars are better than others. So some say that what it's all about is the seed, because the man produces the seed that makes the baby, and he has to put his seed into the woman, or you get no baby. Whereas if the man puts his seed into another man, that's not going to produce a baby. So, all of what they were concerned about was just seed. I find that not even wrong. That's a friend of mine used to put arguments like that. He'd say, that's not even wrong. Of course, they cared about sex and the sex itself. They weren't just caring about whether you get a baby out of it. And some of you who studied biology may have learned that it's not just the man's material, the semen. There's also the woman makes this egg, and that kind of participates somewhat in the production of a baby also. And some people say, yes, but they didn't know that. They thought that women were sort of like just the oven that baked the seed when the guy got it in there. And the evidence from this point of view is nothing. It's ridiculous. Of course they understood that women produced something, and they knew about menstruation, they knew about menopause. I mean, they knew a lot about what goes on with the woman's half of all of that. So if it's not seed, then what is it? Why is it that women aren't forbidden? So some have said, well, it was implicit, that when it said that men aren't allowed, of course you're supposed to understand that includes women too, and that they're not allowed. Now, that's a bit of a concern. I mean, this is a very big matter affecting serious whole lives of women, and that it would be considered like, no, it's implicit. Yeah, if the guys can't do it, the women can't do it either. And that's a very strange argument to make when the very next verse after the law about homosexuality is the law about bestiality. It prohibits having sex with an animal. And it goes out of its way to say a man can't do it and a woman can't do it. Well, how come the women aren't implicit on that one? With a horse. If this gets too sexual for anybody, you can just mute me. You can just mute me. So what else? Some scholars have claimed the reason why it's not forbidden for women is that they were so controlled. Women were so controlled in that society, the guys were in charge. So you didn't have to forbid them from doing it because you just wouldn't let them. This is an argument that was invented by somebody who knows absolutely nothing about sex. I mean, in countries we know today where they're really very powerful in their antipathy to homosexuality, where they kill and torture and do terrible things and have much control in society, men still engage in homosexuality. The sex drive is, maybe you didn't know this, you don't have to, you can read, there was this guy from Vienna who wrote a lot about this, that the sex drive is this very powerful motive among humans, and you can't really accomplish very much by forbidding humans to do things sexually. They do it anyway. And to think that it was just that the women, they're under control, they wouldn't dare go near another woman because, the guys will arrest them. I mean, that's just a non-starter. And then the fourth argument that I've heard from colleagues and Bible scholars is that, after all, the authors of all the law codes especially are all male, which is almost certainly true. There are great portions of the Bible among the stories and the poetry that are quite possibly by females. But the authors of the legal texts in the Bible, in all likelihood, were priests, and the priesthood didn't allow women in. So yeah, it was guys. And so they said, well, the men just weren't all that interested in female sexuality, so they didn't bother writing that into law. And I go, wait a minute. The men in those days weren't interested in female homosexuality? Now, I realize that Playboy wasn't out yet, and I understand that porn movies and porn websites weren't available to them at the time, where they could see women and women, which many of you have heard is a big turn on for men, and it's in all these magazines and movies that are meant for the entertainment of men, and they almost always have a lesbian scene in them. by now, I think almost every major actress I can think of has done at least one lesbian scene in a movie, and somebody's writing those scenes into the scripts. And sometimes they're necessary, and sometimes they're not so necessary for the plot. And the fact is, men are intrigued by that and attracted to it. And, okay, so guys, am I a traitor to my sex because I just admitted it? I mean, come on, it's a fact. There are two kinds of men: those who admit it and those who don't. And it's precisely that I want to get at, the reason why female homosexuality isn't forbidden in the Bible. Because of polygamy. Remember, the subject was polygamy. In our world, we know from movies and magazines and websites and porn sites and whatever that a lot of men are attracted by, they like to get to watch a thing like that. But in their world, where there was polygamy and a man had many wives, if he could afford it to have enough wives, he could have that male fantasy every night of his life to get to see women with women, and he can join in with them or not. His choice. And you have that in a polygamous world, and you don't have it in our monogamous world where you guys got to go outside and find it somewhere. And that being the case, since these guys want it, men are attracted to that, and it's men making the laws. The last thing on earth these guys were going to do was write a law saying we can't have that anymore. We're not going to allow women to do that anymore. It just wasn't going to happen. Now, to me, that is the most likely reason for that curious law. And what's interesting, you see, I spent a little time on it because I wanted to get at it, that it's just one of these many sub things where the fact that they had polygamy changes all kinds of things in their lives. And the amazing thing to me is my colleagues, when I read all this, nobody, as far as I know, but me, has ever proposed that this is the reason why male homosexuality is prohibited and female homosexuality is permitted in the Torah. Even let them propose it and reject it, but nobody's even done that when it seems to me like the most obvious likely answer. But, you know, it's fun being the smartest guy in the room, you know, and the most egotistical. Next point about that, the biblical world. In that world, a woman automatically takes the religion of her husband. That's not a small difference from us. There's no such thing as conversion in the Bible. Nobody in the Bible ever converts to Judaism. There's not a single case. Okay, you're all going to say, Ruth. Okay, Ruth. But what's with Ruth? Ruth is a Moabite woman who marries a Jewish man, so she's Jewish. That's how it works. She didn't have to have a ceremony. She didn't have to go to the mikveh. She didn't have to do anything. She didn't have to take classes with the rabbi, which would have been hard because there were no rabbis yet. So, you know, it's a problem. She simply does the same thing that Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah and all of David's wives and almost all of Solomon's wives, we'll come to that in a moment, that when a woman married a man, she took his religion. It was automatic. Nobody converted. And a man never goes to the woman's religion. Now, that's a patriarchal society. Interestingly, what are the exceptions? Well, there's a tremendous criticism of King Solomon because it said he had so many wives, and a lot of them, you know, these are, I understand Solomon's wives were political marriages. He marries the princesses of all the neighboring cities. And then when it claims that he had 300 wives and 700 concubines, okay, I don't know where to go with that, but, you know, he was trying to top Hugh Hefner or Joe Namath or somebody. And but the text criticizes the fact that the wives of Solomon, who came from other cultures, some of them brought their gods with them, and Solomon even built temples for their gods. And that's just considered a terrible offense. But that's the point, that it's a criticism in the text. It wasn't supposed to work that way. All those princesses who came from all the other cities and other lands that he conquered, they were supposed to become Jews. And you get the same thing, that was in Judah, the same thing you get among the kings of Israel, King Ahab marries Jezebel, Eddie Davis, and Jezebel was the princess of Tyre, which, Phoenicia, what is today Lebanon. And Jezebel retained and promoted the Baal and the Asherah, and she spreads Baal and Asherah worship around Israel. She wasn't supposed to do that. When she marries the king of Israel, she's supposed to become Israelite religion. So the exceptions, though, prove the rule. When she or the wives of Solomon do that, they're criticized for that. Okay. What else? In that world, a woman can be married to a man with no say on who she can marry. She has no say in it, unless her family chooses to give it to her. So, in the book of Genesis, when Abraham's servant goes to find a wife for Isaac, and he finds Rebekah, who's a relative back in Aram, what is today Syria, Laban back in Aram says, he's her brother, he says, well, we'll have to ask the girl herself. If she says she'll go, then we'll let her go. But if not, then not. And you go, isn't that nice? They're asking Rebekah her opinion. And curiously, they then bring her back for Isaac, and nobody asks Isaac's opinion in the matter. She arrives and they get married. All right, so it was a world where young people didn't get to choose their spouses. The men sometimes, or we don't know how much not, and the women maybe some of the time like this. I mean, the case of Rebekah is treated like a very special case that's not typical. If your father wants you to marry Jones, you married Jones. Okay, Schwartz. If your father wanted you to marry Schwartz, then you had to marry Schwartz. Or in the case of levirate marriage, we spoke of in a past meeting, when a man dies leaving no male offspring, child, his brother marries his wife. His brother can refuse to do that, and then there's a ceremony of refusal, but she can't refuse. The wife has to accept this relationship. Likewise, in political marriages, you don't think all those princesses got asked if they wanted to marry the king when their father is making a treaty with a foreign king. So you seal the treaty by having your daughter marry the king of the other country. Nobody's asking the daughter about that. So David was married to a Geshurite princess, and their son was Absalom, who almost became the next king of Israel. So what should we do with a world like that? There's the one other law that fits in with it. There's the law of the raped virgin. If a man rapes a virgin daughter of somebody, there's a settlement with the father and the man that says must marry the woman he raped, and he can never divorce her as long as he lives and she lives. And if you're the woman, you go, oh, isn't that great? That's just terrific compensation. He has to marry me and can't divorce me, the guy who raped me. But that worked that way. And indeed, a lot of us now look at this and say, wait a minute, all of these marriages are rapes. Unless in an arranged marriage, the woman is crazy about the guy and she feels very lucky to have gotten this particular guy. She had no say in it, which means she's been signed on for rape by her husband for the rest of her life. And that happens in a world where it's all arranged marriages and where the woman has no say in who she marries, except Rebekah. And after all, even Rebekah, she's agreeing to a marriage to a guy she's never met, So we have to be sensitive to that, and in our world, more and more we are. And this actually got me into trouble. Unjustly, of course. I was reading about in my commentary and in my last book, I read about the law of the rape of captured women. One of the main things that happens in war is that the winners rape the women of the loser side. It's a fact of war. And it's a horrible thing. Some of you may have seen Sophia Loren made a movie called Two Women, where she and her daughter are both raped by the other side who have won. And they're gang raped by all the soldiers. And that's what happens in war. So the Torah has a law that seems to be intended to get rid of that and to try to put some kind of restraint on that. Because in the heat of battle, after fighting and after risking your life and all of that you've seen happen all day, and then there are women who are vulnerable and nobody left to protect them because your side won, men will do that. So if you would just make a rule saying, don't do that, that's not nice, that won't stop them. So the law in the Torah is psychologically dealing with that in a different manner. So I'll read you the law. Here's the whole thing. When you'll go out to war against your enemies, and Yahweh your God will put him in your hand, and you'll take prisoners from him, and you'll see among the prisoners a woman with a beautiful figure, and you'll be attracted to her and take her for yourself as a wife. Then you shall bring her into your house, and she shall shave her head and do her nails, and take away her prisoner's garment from on her. And she shall live in your house, and shall mourn her father and her mother a month of days. And after that, you may come to her and marry her, and she shall become your wife. And if it will be that you don't desire her then, you shall let her go on her own, and you shall not sell her for money. You shall not get profit through her because you degraded her. So apparently what they've done is they said, oh, it's okay. Yeah, you're allowed to take that woman. And they said, whoa, not so fast, Ishmael. You have to take her home, and you have to leave her alone for a month and let her make herself less attractive to you, and then you can marry her. And if you don't marry her, then she leaves on her own and you can't do anything. You're not allowed to sell her. You don't own her. So I thought that was a pretty good thing to try to put the brakes on rape. I did read somewhere online, someplace, a rabbi criticized me for that. She said that I was being insensitive to the reality of that situation, which is this woman is now forced to marry a guy. So she's going to be raped by him for the rest of her life. And I hear the criticism there, and I understand why she thought that, except my point was, but that's what all marriage was in that world. That's what it always was, is the women have no say. They're all being raped for the rest of their lives unless they're lucky enough to really like the guy. And so the law about the not raping a woman in battle, it wasn't that I'm not sensitive to that. It's, to me, it was just so obvious that I neglected to mention it. So, I mean, she's right. I should have mentioned it. But it's not that they didn't care about the possibility of rape of the woman for the rest of her life. In that world, that's how marriage was. And what she was doing is she was acquiring the same status as all the other married women instead of all the slaves. So my final point on all this is women in that world are not property. And I happen to have that in my notes in bold print. Trust me, it's in bold print in my notes, and nothing else on the page is. Because you constantly hear people say women in the biblical world were property. You even hear some biblical scholars say that. But that's not correct. It's not factual. The only humans who are property in the Bible are slaves, which are male or female. Wives cannot be sold. The law of the captured woman in war at the end says emphatically, you shall not sell her. Women can influence a family's affairs or a nation's. They can own property. Some laws are written in their favor. These are not just differences from property. These are essential definitional differences. This was a culture that gave us a commandment to honor mothers as well as fathers. And it gave us Eshet Chayil, about a woman who keeps her household alive. And all those family stories in Genesis where wives never once appear as property, plus all the comparable family stories in 2 Samuel, where women are not property, plus the limitation on having many wives in the law of the king, plus even the line in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes, about women being bad. You know that one that says that I find more evil than, okay, I just happen to have it here. Not the exact. I find more bitter than death, woman. She is traps, and her heart is nets. Her hands are manacles. One who is good before God will escape from her, while a sinner will be caught by her. It's about the worst thing in the Bible about women. And I've written about it, and I think I can explain it, but my point is not to get anybody out of anything or to apologize for anything, make everything come out okay. but to recognize that even that thing, what's negative about women is that they have power. It's not that they're property. It's the powerful woman that becomes a threat to men. I lost my place. Plus, the text has the requirement that the mother as well as the father have to bring the rebellious son to court. That famous law requires both the mother and the father to agree to it. With all those elements in the biblical text, I just don't think that I read all those things and say I'm reading here about a culture in which women are commonly viewed as property. Every bit of that goes against it. Still, in Genesis 3, you remember the curse on women, God says, your desire will be to your man and he will dominate you. That's pretty clear. But after Genesis 3, that's etiological, not prescriptive. It's not somebody saying that's the way life ought to be. That's somebody who's looking at the way life is, which is like snakes don't have legs, roses have thorns, people die, people have to work, all kinds of things happen, women have labor pain. All these things are not commandments on people to do anything. They're stories explaining why the world is the way it is, including the bad stuff. And the fact is that men did dominate their women. So that story is supposed to be the story of how that started. But they dominate, they don't own them. Women aren't property. They don't have as good a deal as men. So let's be clear, written by men in charge. It was a guy world. It's not right for a guy to get up and lecture and say, no, it was really just fine. It wasn't really just fine, but women are not property. And the law says about a man who sells his daughter to another man, it says explicitly, she doesn't serve as a maid there. The other man can make her his wife, or he can give her to his son as a wife. And if not, it says he shall still treat her like a daughter, not like a slave or a possession. And if he marries any other women after her, it says he's not allowed to reduce her food, her clothing, or her hygiene. And if not, he says that he lets her go out for free, no money. Again, he can't sell her. It says he shall not dominate to sell her. It's the exact word that's used in the Garden of Eden story, where it says the man will dominate the woman. It says in this situation, he is explicitly told not to dominate. And I take that as a classic example of where a standard of law in the Bible can change even within the Bible. There is always recognition that law can change. And that's why we can be talking today about how different that biblical world was from ours, because even within that world, the changes started, and then they just, by the time we got to the rabbinic era, somebody pressed the fast forward button on change. But here we are today in a week where we've seen the fast forward button pressed and held. So there, I got relevant in the last moment. Everybody, it's been a bad week. I wish everybody a better one next week. And that's it.
Thank you so much. Do you want to take questions?
I'll try. If my throat holds up, I'll take them. And then if I don't want to answer anybody, I can use that.
Right.
I'm so sorry.
Right. Well, so if you have a question, you should click on the hand raise button in the participants area of Zoom. There's a question here in the chat from Glenn who's asking about women in particular. He notes Miriam and Deborah, who have a greater degree of power, assumedly, than your typical women. And could you talk a little bit about that? And it occurs to me that the Song of Deborah and the Song of the Sea are some of the most ancient material in the Bible. So my question is, how does that accord with what you're talking about in terms of the evolution of the role of women? Because it seems that maybe there's also a devolution if some of those early women were actually leaders of the community.
Yeah. I don't know that Miriam was a leader. I know that the Song of the Sea, but in one of the two authors who covers it, attributes it to her singing it, not necessarily writing it. And the Song of Deborah is often people attribute it to Deborah because we call it Song of Deborah, but in fact, in the song, it speaks in second person to Deborah, which seemingly means it's written by somebody else. But still, to me, that's still a tremendous thing that these aren't just two of the oldest things. these are the two oldest things in the Bible. And you can tell by all kinds of things, like when you read Shakespeare, you can tell it's older English than my English. You'll trust me on this, that there are 5 old songs that are the oldest things in the Bible. And 2 of them, and probably the 2 oldest, are Song of Miriam and the Song of Deborah. And to me, that's amazing that the first 2 things, in the Bible, are both connected with, in one way or another, women. So first of all, it shouldn't come as a surprise that women, especially if they wrote it, are the poets. And in fact, the first known poet on earth, the first known artist writing anything, right, is Enheduanna, who is in Sumerian. She's the daughter of Sargon, and she's the first named writer known on earth, and definitely a woman. And so we know that in literature, women have always had a prominent role. And the other thing, though, about Deborah, which would fit more really what you're asking, is Deborah is the mother of Israel in that poem. And it's mother of Israel the way George Washington is the father of the United States. The first time we see in the Bible all of Israel acting together, united as a country in their land, it's in the book of Judges, it's in Judges 4 and 5, and their leader is Deborah. That's not a minor point. And I don't know if it means that it got devolved from there. Yeah, I'd say I'd have to suspect that some people, I think I know what they're called men, worked very hard to diminish this history that identified her as that. So for example, in the book of Genesis, it says they came to this place where a woman named Deborah died and was buried there under a tree. And she was Deborah, who was the nurse of Rebecca. And you go, what the heck? Where did this come from? We were never told the name of Rebecca's nurse. And Rebecca's dead. And she's buried under a tree, and her name is Deborah. And in the book of Judges, there's this Deborah who always judges the people sitting under a tree. And what I strongly suspect is that there really was such a tomb in ancient Israel, and it was the tomb of Deborah, and it was preserved the way we care about the tomb of George Washington. And when they diminished Deborah later, somebody said, "Oh, what's that?" They said, "Tomb of Deborah." And you go, "Ooh, Deborah? No, not that Deborah. This is the she was a nurse of Rebecca. It's nothing important. Don't worry about that." And they lowered her. We guys do stuff like that.
Yeah,
it's not nice. It's not fair. And it's time for Deborah to be recognized, really. And it wasn't a female scholar even who identified it, and it wasn't even a male or female feminist scholar. It was Baruch Halpern, who's like the greatest biblical historian, and I brought him here. He's my colleague now at Georgia. And it was Halpern in one of his earliest books identified that in the Song of Deborah and showed that, that she's the founding mother of Israel and all. And he didn't do it to make a big point. It's only a couple pages out of his whole book. He wasn't trying to make a point. He could have written it up as an op-ed and it would have been right in the New York Times. He wasn't out to do that. But it's like, it should be recognized already that she's of tremendous importance.
Is there other material in the Bible? And by the way, if folks have questions, please raise your hand. But is there other, if not, I'll ask, is there other material that you think has a likelihood of having origins with a female writer? Like, for example, Yochi Brandis, the Israeli novelist, wrote an essay where she thought she sensed a woman's voice in the book of Ruth as a kind of a primary author that maybe was then reworked by men in certain areas. But I mean, is there any way to have any sense about that?
Not about Ruth. I don't see any myself. I mean, I don't know of any particular reason to think Ruth was written by a woman. Could have been or not. There's an interesting woman sensitivity in it. Ruth has the only clear Freudian slip in the Bible. when Naomi is sending Ruth to go out in the field and lie with, to have sex with
Boaz.
Boaz, that's his name. And she says to him, and you will go and uncover his legs and you will lie down with him. And the way she puts it, it should be in Hebrew, vishachaft, and you will lie down. It says, but if you look in the consonantal text without the vowels, it says vishachavti, which would mean, and I will lie down with him. And people said, yes, she's this old woman who can't anymore. She said, I can't produce anymore. And now she's sending the young woman to have sex. And she said, so you'll go and you will lie down with him, And now actually there's a grammatical reason for that yud there. So it actually isn't a Freudian slip, but it makes such a good comment that I retain it anyway. And if that is what it was meant to be, which is possible, I could see a woman thinking of that. Now, I know a man writer could, but it just seems more. But no, I've argued that I think more and more the whole of the first great work of prose ever written by anybody on earth, which included all of the texts known as J in the Torah, and all of the court history of David and 2 Samuel, and large portions of Joshua, Judges, and 1 Samuel in between, and the first 2 chapters of Kings. So that's a lengthy, the longest single work in the Bible. And the first known prose on earth. So if you think it's recording fact, then it's the oldest history in the world. If you think it's fiction, then it's the first novel in the world. But whatever it is, it's the first one of those in the world. And that one, I can tell you, I've read that so many times, and more as I read it, I become persuaded that could easily have been written by a woman. Whereas the other early prose of the Bible is almost certainly written by men because it's almost all by priests, the E and P and D texts and the texts and the first 8 chapters of Judges and second half of Joshua and the stories of the kings of Israel and Judah in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, even Esther, Daniel. Those all seem guy-ish to me. Notice I pronounce that carefully, guy-ish. But I do think that this one work, which is the first great work in history of prose, I used to say 50-50. At worst, it's 50-50, whether it was a man or a woman. Today, I go 51-52 that it was a woman. I admit, it's like, the person you're talking about, I don't know her, but sometimes, especially since she's a writer herself, sometimes you get a sense of an author. Mm-hmm. When you've read an author a lot, you really get some feel for that. And I've read this many times, and only in Hebrew, of course. Man, it really could be a woman. Great writer.
Yeah, I was going to ask what in Yochi Brandis's thinking about Ruth, it had to do, I think, with the female characters driving the plot in a way that is unusual in the Bible. But in Jay, when you read it, what is it that, is it more just a gut sense or is there something specific that gives you that sense?
The sensitivity to the feelings of women, which you don't expect and don't find in the others. The way in which women, the ongoing thing through all of these stories is women in a man's world finding their way to have some kind of control over their lives. Mm-hmm. And the way women can do that in a men's world is, first of all, through their sons. Second, through sex, through manipulation. In Delilah's case, you do it through nagging, through all kinds of good and bad reasons. At Potiphar's wife, you do it by lying. There's all kinds of ways that they do it. But this is a woman who's sensitive to that. All the tools in a woman's toolkit to have some kind of control over her life in a world where the guys are in charge. And I could easily see that being a woman. And you go, well, did women write then? Yeah, they did, as a matter of fact. In cultures, especially where there is literacy, but it's limited, an upper class woman is more likely to be literate than a lower class man. And so it's entirely, and there's every indication that those texts I'm describing were written by somebody from the upper class. So, I can make a real case outside of my gut, which I trust even more than my evidence, that this first great writer on earth was a woman. Cool.
Yeah. Well, we've reached the end of the hour, so thank you so much for this great talk, and thanks for everybody for being here. And we'll be here next week with a talk on humor in a time of catastrophe, right? Or
Yeah, we could use that.
yeah, we could definitely use that.
Okay, everybody, please be well. Stay safe.
Thank you so much. Bye.